Bum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum.
Welcome to Everyday Musicality, the podcast in which we discuss all things related to Gordon's music learning theory and how it can help unlock the inner musician that lives inside of all of us. I'm your host, Heather Shouldice, music educator and faculty member for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. In this episode, I celebrate some very exciting news. Hello and welcome to Everyday Musicality. I hope this finds you well and healthy and refreshed and re-energized for the new school year. Personally, I'm feeling very energized and excited because my book is out. It is so cool to see it, to hold it in my hands, and I'm just so excited to have it be out there and hopefully help you in your application of music learning theory in your teaching. It's available from our podcast sponsor, GIA Publications, and the book is called Weaving It All Together, a practical guide to applying Gordon's music learning theory in the elementary general music program. However, I want to mention that even if you're not an elementary general music teacher, I think this book can be a great resource for any kind of MLT practitioner. Even though a lot of the teaching activities are geared towards elementary general music, there's a lot of great information just about music learning theory in general, such as levels of the scale learning sequence, ways that you can bridge throughout those levels, all sorts of just general important information about music learning theory. So I thought today in this episode, I would just give a quick overview of the book and share a little bit about what's in it so that you know if it's something that you might be interested in. Also, so that you know if it's something you might like to enter a giveaway for. First, a word about the title. I call this book Weaving It All Together because teaching with music learning theory and designing a curriculum using music learning theory involves weaving together a number of different instructional strands. We are planning the tonal content that we're teaching, the rhythm content that we're teaching, how we're progressing that content through the levels of the skill learning sequence. We're also planning how we are going to incorporate things like instruments into our teaching, how we're going to incorporate harmony into our teaching, all these different kinds of things. And then if we want to get a bit more systematic, how we might actually sit down and plan a curriculum based on music learning theory. And so that's where the title of this book came from. It's all about how we weave together these various pieces of music learning theory-based instruction to form a cohesive, sequential, and meaningful music learning experience for our students. Also related to the title, a note about the cover art. The cover art features an actual piece of weaving from an artist in northern Michigan. She was referred to me by Cindy Taggart. Cindy has a lovely little art shop up in Empire, Michigan called The Secret Garden. If you are ever in northern Michigan, you should definitely check it out. She has all kinds of art pieces, clothing, jewelry. It's really a great place. So I knew I wanted to feature some sort of weaving on the cover, and I asked Cindy, and Cindy referred me to a fantastic artist named Holly Sorensen, who's up in northern Michigan, and Holly does fantastic weaving. So I contacted Holly and she sent me some photographs of some different pieces she had created, and I found one that I just loved the colors for. It uses bright different rainbow colors, and so I got that piece from Holly. And then one of my daughter's preschool classmates, his mother is a photographer. Her name's Lisa Sutton. She is the owner of Lisa Sutton Photography, and she photographed this lovely piece of weaving from Holly, and that is the art that you see on the cover of Weaving It All Together. So what is actually in this book? It's structured into three main parts. The first part, part one, is called The Big Picture. Part two is called Navigating Skill Learning Sequence. And part three is called Weaving the Threads. So I'll just give you a brief taste of what's included in each of those main parts of the book. In part 1, called The Big Picture, which is chapters 2, 3, and 4, I wanted to just give an overview of music learning theory so that you could get acclimated to the main ideas of music learning theory. In chapter 2, which is called MLT 101, Basic Tenets of Music Learning Theory, I talk about the 3 core tenets of music learning theory, which are audiation, music aptitude, and sequential music learning. Those might sound familiar because those were the first mini-series of episodes that I did in this podcast. So if you listen back to episodes 1, 2, and 3, you can hear about those ideas that I feature in chapter 2, which is called MLT 101. Next, in chapter 3, I talk about context and content. So in this chapter, I start to talk about the idea of the whole part whole learning process in music learning theory, and then I structure the chapter into context and content. In the context section, I talk about the importance of musical context and then really dig into tonality and meter. There's an overview of the main tonalities that are common in music learning theory-based teaching. I talk about the differences between the tonalities. I give examples of composed songs in the different tonalities, as well as a chart for each tonality that refers to music that you might encounter in the real world in each of these different tonalities. I also do the same with meters. I talk about how Gordon has organized the different meters, and I provide examples of music in those different meters as well. So if you're newer to the different tonalities and meters in MLT-based instruction, you might find chapter 3 really helpful for that reason. Then at the end of chapter 3, I talk about content, so tonal pattern and rhythm pattern instruction and the basics of how we provide tonal and rhythm pattern instruction for our students. Things like coming up with the patterns that we're going to teach, gestures, all of those kinds of things I give an overview of in chapter 3. Next, in chapter 4, skill learning sequence, I talk about the skill learning sequence. So I provide an overview of the levels of skill learning sequence. I give a brief description of what the essence of each of those levels is. And then I talk about stepwise movement and bridging movement, the 2 different ways that we can sequence our instruction through that skill learning sequence. So if you're just getting into music learning theory and you're just starting to get acclimated to terms like aural and partial synthesis, chapter 3 might be really helpful for you. Next is part 2, which is called Navigating Skill Learning Sequence. In these chapters 5 through 12, I devote 1 chapter to each level of the skill learning sequence and really dig into what that level of the skill learning sequence is all about, what are the skills that we might be teaching and learning at each level, sample activity ideas for skills at that level, and then ideas for incorporating instruments, harmony, and also bridging to inference levels from levels of discrimination learning. So, for example, in chapter 5, I devote about 25 pages to the aural skill level. If you're familiar with Gordon's book, Learning Sequences in Music, you know that he does talk about levels of the skill learning sequence in that book, but they are fairly brief descriptions of the skill levels. What I tried to do in my book is to expand upon that and to really paint a picture of what that skill level looks like and what kinds of skills we might be helping our students to develop at that level of learning. So after giving an introduction to what the aural skill level is, I provide a chart with the different tonal skills and rhythm skills that we could be teaching at the aural level. And then I go on to describe each of those specific skills in more detail and provide sample teaching processes for those various skills at that skill level. For each of those specific tonal and rhythm skills, I also mention what learning sequence activity pages correspond with that skill, so that if you want to really reinforce a skill in your classroom, you can see which learning sequence activities you can use to introduce that skill, and then a number of activity ideas that you could use to reinforce that skill in classroom activities. Also, because I really wanted this book to bridge the gap between Gordon's Learning Sequences in Music, which is purely theoretical, and then the Jump Right In General Music Series books, which provide a lot of activities, but not really a whole lot of guidance on how to kind of put it all together. My goal in this book was to bridge those two resources. So for that reason, also when I talk about each specific skill that we might be introducing at a particular skill level, I give examples of corresponding activities from the Jump Right In General Music books. So you'll see a bullet point list of examples from Jump Right In that you could go to for teaching that specific skill. Finally, at the end of each of the chapters in Part 2 on the levels of skill learning sequence, I finish by talking about how you can build and extend learning at that skill level. So, for example, in the oral chapter, at the end of the chapter, I have a section on teaching a song by rote at the oral skill level. I have a section on harmonic audiation and skill at the oral level, extending oral learning to instruments, and then bridging to inference learning from the oral level. So in that section, I talk about which levels of inference learning you could bridge to from oral, and then refer you to the appropriate sections of those inference learning chapters so you could find activity ideas for teaching those skills at inference learning. So that's Part 2, which ends up being almost 200 pages just devoted to each of the levels of skill learning sequence. Well, not 200 levels devoted to each level, but in total, 200 pages where I really dig into all of the different levels and provide more specifics on what those might look and sound like. Last, in Part 3 of the book, which I call Weaving the Threads, I address various aspects of the MLT-based curriculum that you might want to include or that you might want to think about, and then how you can start putting everything together to provide a cohesive learning experience for your students. First, in Chapter 13, I focus on informal guidance and its importance as readiness for formal instruction. If you want to go back and listen to previous episodes, I did a mini-series of episodes on informal guidance starting back in episode 13, so you can check out that little mini-series of episodes. So in Chapter 13, I talk about preparatory audiation. Hey, that's weird. I just noticed Chapter 13 of the book, and it was episode 13 of the podcast. Totally not planned. Anyway, random thought for the day. So in Chapter 13 on informal guidance, I start out by talking about preparatory audiation and the types and stages of preparatory audiation. And then I get into ways that we can help our elementary general music students progress through preparatory audiation into audiation by providing informal guidance. And I give ideas for practical activities for helping students build their listening vocabulary, helping build their musical speaking vocabulary, so their singing, chanting, and moving and playing vocabulary, and other ideas for encouraging audiation development so that students will be ready for formal instruction. In this chapter, I also talk about informal guidance for older students, as well as students with special needs, and then I finish off the chapter by talking about informal guidance for notation. I refer to this as informal notation awareness, how we can help students develop emergent music literacy in an informal way, in a playful way, well before we are going to introduce notation through formal instruction at the symbolic association skill level. So I talk about ways that we can just expose students to notation without expecting them to understand it or to be able to read it or write it with correctness. Just like when children are young, we expose them to books and we read to them, and that helps them develop the readiness to learn to read on their own. We can do the same thing musically. So that's what I end Chapter 13 with. Next, in Chapter 14, I talk about harmonic skill development. So this is a sequence for developing harmonic skills that I don't know where it originated. It's something I've learned through the various music learning theory trainings that I've taken, but it's just not really written down in detail anywhere. It's briefly mentioned in Jump Right In General Music series, book 4, but it's really not expounded upon in detail. So I wanted to put this into a chapter and really dig into it. So this is an idea of how we can start by helping students audiate resting tone, and then we can build on that in incremental ways, moving on to resting tone accompaniments, tonic and dominant ostinati, and then getting into tonic and dominant chord root accompaniments, and finally getting all the way to rounds eventually. So that's what I talk about in chapter 14, ideas for how we could teach each of those steps in harmonic skill development, as well as how that could connect with levels of the skill learning sequence. Next, in chapter 15, I focus on instrumental applications of MLT, so how we can use instruments in our classroom as an extension of audiation to give our students one more avenue for expressing their musicianship. I break this up into different sections. First, I focus on unpitched percussion, and then I focus on pitched percussion. And within each of those sections, I talk about how we can help students do instrument exploration, where they just get a chance to mess around on the instruments. And then I get into formal skills that can be taught on the instruments. And I also include a chart of ideas for how you could use those different kinds of instruments at each level of the skill learning sequence, as well as sample activities that you could use to teach some of those instruments at some levels of the skill learning sequence. Finally, I end that chapter by talking about using ukulele in MLT-based instruction, and then how I incorporate recorder into my MLT-based instruction. Next, chapter 16 is called Guiding and Documenting Individual Student Growth. In this chapter, I talk about measuring music aptitude, and I give an overview of some of the various published music aptitude tests that Dr. Gordon has developed that can be used with elementary general music students. I weigh the pros and cons of the different tests, which tests are appropriate for which ages of students, as well as giving tips for administering the tests and using the test results. Then in the second part of that chapter, I talk about documenting music achievement and monitoring growth. So in other words, assessment. I talk about different forms of assessment that we could use to assess students' musical skills, and talk about building rating scales as well as sharing some sample rating scales. Next, chapter 17 is called Making LSAs Work. In this chapter, I really dig into advice for teaching learning sequence activities, especially for those who have struggled to do so in the past. So first I talk about when to begin teaching LSAs, when and for how long to teach LSAs, thinking about the physical arrangement of your room when you're teaching LSAs, as well as making them fun for you and your students. Then I have a fairly long section called Advice for Teaching Specific LSA Pages, where I go through unit by unit, tonally and rhythmically, and I talk about specific units or pages that I know a lot of teachers have struggled with, as well as myself in the past. And I give advice for how I've tailored those pages, how I've tweaked those pages to make them work with my students and help them be successful. Finally, I finish off that chapter by talking about maximizing efficiency in LSAs, progressing through the pages, prioritizing pages and skills, and making LSAs your own. Last, chapter 18 is called Planning and Sequencing Instruction, and in this chapter, I tried to structure it in terms of short-term planning, medium-term planning, and long-term planning. So first I talk about short-term planning, in other words, building a lesson plan. In this section, I talk about the things that I think about when building a lesson plan, the things that I try to include in most of my lesson plans, and what I think about as I actually sit down to sequence a lesson plan. Next, in medium-term planning, I talk about extending learning across multiple weeks, months, or years. So, for example, how can you get the most bang for your buck out of one song or chant by sequencing it across different amounts of time? So how could you build with that song or chant across several weeks, months, or grade levels? Finally, I talk about long-term planning. So how can you sequence music learning across the entire elementary music program? First in this section, I talk about developing your vision and your core goals for your students. Then I talk through different ways that you can combine skill learning sequence and content learning sequences to help your students progress across time in those ways. And then I finish the chapter talking about curriculum mapping, how you can sit down and map out across all the grade levels in your program how you're going to get them from day one of kindergarten to the end of their last grade level with you, and really get them to become as independent and skilled musicians as you possibly can in that amount of time in a thoughtful way. I also include what I think are some fairly helpful appendices. The first appendix gives a little one-page overview of all the different tonalities and their characteristic harmonic functions. Appendix B gives a one-page overview of meters as well as the beat function-based rhythm syllables. Appendix C is a list of different resources for songs and chants in a variety of tonalities and meters. Appendix D gives a one-page tonal pattern starter kit. So if you're new to thinking of tonic and dominant patterns in major and minor, this will give you a little cheat sheet of some patterns you can start with. And then Appendix E gives a one-page rhythm pattern starter kit with patterns in duple and triple, both macrobeat, microbeat patterns, and division elongation patterns. Next, Appendix F is a harmonic index that I had created for my own teaching when I was looking for a particular song that uses certain chords in a given context. So if I was sitting down going, oh, I need a song that uses 1-4-5 in major, I created this list where I could just sit down and look up major 1-4-5 and find a song that uses those chords. So this includes songs from Jump Right In grades 1 through 4, and it's organized by tonality and chord function. In Appendix G, I give an example of an adapted LSA that I came up with for symbolic association. And in Appendix H, I give a list of a possible adapted LSA order. So how you could tweak the order of the LSA pages by doing certain pages in a different order or omitting certain pages across the grade levels, just as an example. And then in Appendix I have a chart that gives an overview of all of the pages in Register Books 1, Tonal and Rhythm, just so that if you want a little snapshot of everything that's in those books, you have it right there. And then finally, in Appendix J, I have a number of sample lesson plans. So I have 2 lesson plans for each grade from kindergarten through 4th grade that were from my own teaching. And then lastly, in Appendix K, I show my own sample curriculum maps that I was using back when I was teaching students full-time elementary general music. So that's my book. It was so much fun to work on. I hope that it's really useful for you, and I hope that it helps fill the gap in trying to take Dr. Gordon's theoretical ideas from learning sequences in music to implementing the activities in the Jump Right In General Music series. Finally, I am excited to announce a giveaway of my book. If you would like a free copy of my new book, you can do one of a few different things. You can send me an email at everydaymusicality@gmail.com and simply write in big capital letters, "I want your book." Or you can go to the Everyday Musicality Podcast Facebook page and you can write on the wall of the page in big capital letters, "I want your book." Or you could share the book on social media. I'll add a link to it from the GIA website in the show notes. If you just share that link on social media, you can say anything you want about it. You could say, "I'm excited to get this book," and tag the Everyday Musicality Podcast page on Facebook. Or if you're sharing on Twitter or Instagram or some other platform, I don't have podcast pages on those platforms. So you could just take a screen cap of your share of the book and email it to me at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. And you will be entered in the giveaway for a free copy. Last but not least, I want to give a big thank you to everyone who has or is supporting me on Patreon, and a big shout out to new supporter, Catherine Brunner. Thank you so much for contributing. It's just one little way that you can help make this podcast keep going. If you'd like to contribute, you can make a monthly donation at patreon.com/everydaymusicality. Or if you'd like to make a one-time donation, Patreon only does recurring transactions as of right now, so you can set up a monthly contribution, and then as soon as the first one clears, you can cancel it. So thank you to everyone who has supported or is thinking of supporting currently. I am back soon with new episodes. You can expect a new episode in 2 weeks, and I will bring you lots of exciting things this school year, including guests, more giveaways, and lots of great MLT content. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. You can email me or send me a voice memo at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and let's keep musicking every day.